Hello, and welcome to this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science, where we will examine a potentially controversial topic in science in order to better understand the basic science concepts involved in the associated ethical debates. I'm John Hoffman, a professor of biology, and I teach these scenarios in my university seminar, Scientific Ethics. This week's Ethical Dilemma in Science is too elite to compete, not eligible to participate in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. And so what we're choosing for this week's ethical dilemma is focusing in on the Olympic trials, preparing for the Olympics, which just started this week. And again, because of my interest, focusing in on Olympic level running. And so what we had was two relatively young, relatively new runners from Namibia who came onto the scene early on in 2021 and had some really world-class times, some really incredibly fast times, bordering on, kind of world record levels. And so this is, interesting, but it's also kind of potentially intriguing because this is in an area that produces a lot of elite athletes. And then all of a sudden, two of them are coming out at an elite status. And so what happened is these individuals went for a medical examination after their performance. And what was determined is that these individuals both had naturally high testosterone levels. And so there's going to be a variability from low levels to high levels across the population. And these two individuals just had naturally high levels of testosterone. High enough that they were actually above the limits that are set forth with the governing body for these Olympic runners. And so because of this, they're not eligible to participate in events, running events between 400 meters and 1600 meters. And so what does this involve? What does this mean? So to start out with the Olympic Games, which are just, again, as I said, starting up the 2020 Olympic Games in Tokyo, are starting the summer of 2021. And this is an opportunity for athletes from across the globe to be able to come together in friendly competition. And so what we're looking at is this idea that people are passionate about their athletes, are passionate about their athletic teams. And we could be talking about Olympic athletes, we could be talking about professional sports teams, even collegiate teams. People are really going to be passionate about that. And in most cases, people are going to be more passionate about following elite athletes like Mo Farah, who won the Olympic gold medal in the 10,000 meter race in the 2012 London Olympics. They're more likely to want to watch Mo Farah as opposed to some random biology professor running a 5K on Arcadia's campus. And so, so we're interested in watching elite athletes. What's it take to become an elite athlete? And what are your odds of becoming an elite athlete? And so looking at some data, again, based on, kind of the United States, looking at basketball, because we've got men's and women's basketball, what we can see is that the odds of becoming an elite basketball player, as well as an elite athlete in many other sports, is going to be incredibly small. But keep in mind that people do it. There are elite athletes that are emerging every year. But what is involved? What does it take? And so what we can see is that the number of high school athletes, either in men's basketball or women's basketball, we've got about 500,000 athletes, 500,000 men, a little bit above that, a little less than 500,000 women playing high school basketball. Now, when you move up to the collegiate level, playing basketball for a college, what we can see is that it drops down from, around, 500,000 down to under 20,000 in a given year. A little bit fewer for women's than men's, but you can see that it becomes very rare or very unlikely that a high school athlete is going to make it to the college level. If we go from the college down to the pros, so drafted by the pros, and not even indicating that they're going to, be on the team and play for the team, we're going to see that it's going to be getting down kind of less than 50 in a given year when we take a look at this. And so what that means then is that your odds of becoming a professional basketball player after playing high school athletics is about 1 in 12,000 or 1 in 13,000, whether you're talking about men's basketball or women's basketball. And again, keep in mind that this doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means that it's becoming very, very challenging. And so, what is it that needs to happen in order for an individual to become this naturally elite athlete? And so, we take a look at natural athletic achievement. And what we're going to see is it's going to be a factor of nature and nurture, a factor of biology and environment. And so, from the biological standpoint, it's going to be determining your genetics, the information that's passed on to you in your DNA from your mother and your father. And that could be, determining your kind of your bone structure, kind of your body size, muscle composition, whether you got fast twitch muscles or slow twitch muscles, how much muscle you're growing. All of that is going to be directed by the DNA. But it's not the DNA alone that's going to be having an effect. You can have, perfect genetics, and I'm not sure what that is. But if you don't go through and do the training and prepare for the sport, you're not going to become a natural athlete. And so that nurture, that environment component, I'm actually breaking up into two components, both a commitment component and a support component. So the commitment component is, kind of the dedication to put in the necessary hours of training. And so I know we're talking about, Summer Olympics now, going to a Winter Olympics example. You hear about these ice skaters that are doing figure skating, that are going to their local ice rink at 5 o'clock in the morning to get ice time in before they go to school. That shows a lot of commitment because you got to get up in order to get there at 5 o'clock in the morning. These individuals, have to maintain a healthy diet. And so they can't have the junk food and the ice cream and the soda and the salty pretzels and chips and all of those things. They need to be eating in kind of a healthy way that kind of promotes kind of muscle and kind of efficient use of energy within their body. Even things like training, you go to kind of a higher altitude, you go out to Colorado and train up in the mountains where there's less oxygen being present in the atmosphere at these higher elevations. You can work out there, and it's a lot harder to work out because there's less oxygen. So your body has to adapt, and it can take those adaptations and make it more efficient at carrying and using oxygen within your body. So all of that takes a commitment. And I would argue that as well as that individual commitment, you need support. You need support from your significant other, family, friends. For the example of the ice skater going at 5 o'clock in the morning to skate before school, chances are, you've got a parent that's getting up even before that to be able to go pack the kid up and take them to the ice rink. And so you could be as dedicated and committed as possible to training. But if you don't have the support that would allow you to have the time to focus on that, to be able to get there and be able to have a lot of your other kind of life activities taken care of, it becomes very difficult to become that natural athletic achiever, to become that elite athlete under natural circumstances. Now, if we take a look at what's involved, again, we said one of the components was going to be genetics. And a book that came out by David Epstein about 10 years ago now focused in on one kind of region of DNA called a gene that carries information that was thought to be related to athletic performance. And over time, it's been discovered that more and more genes are going to be associated with athletic performance. Lots and lots of them have an impact on the ability of an individual to be able to prepare and train and compete at that elite level. And so if we take a look at a more recent study, a 2020 study that came out, taking a look at the effect of genetics on athletic performance, looking at speed and power and endurance. They looked at about 68 genetic variants. So they're basically looking at 68 different genes or 68 different regions of DNA. And they're looking at those variants, the kind of set of information that's there that's not present in everybody. that promotes endurance. And they looked 68 of those genes and the variants associated with it. They took a look at 48 genes associated with speed and power. With this idea then, with about 116 genes, they would be able to look at kind of a range of kind of genetic kind of predisposition or genetic preparation for preparing. And so what we've got on this slide is this idea that they looked at over 500 regular individuals, not elite athletes, and they basically graded them. And they said that if you have this variant that is associated with better athletic performance at one of these genes, you're going to get a point. And so the more of these variants, the more of the genes that you have that are promoting athletic performance, the higher score that is going to be present. And so if we take a look at the results, we see kind of a very wide distribution of these genes, of these variants, the information within our DNA associated with athleticism. And it goes from a very high level to very low level, but basically kind of most of the people are going to be kind of in that mid-level. And again, this is looking at the regular people. When we start dropping elite athletes, and then in this study, they looked at 5 elite athletes, what they saw was that these elite athletes in general were going to be higher than the population. Their scores, they had more of these athletic genes, if we want to think about it that way, the genes for athletic performance. They had more of those than the regular person. But that wasn't the only factor. There were non-athletes that had higher levels. There were elite competitors that had lower levels of these genes. And so the genes are, again, they're having an impact. They're going to be important, but you can't change the genetics. And it basically kind of gives you kind of this predisposition that you can then apply the commitment, apply the dedication, and apply the supports for in order to become that elite athlete. Now, many times people don't want to put the hard work in as they look for a shortcut. And so one of the most common shortcuts to elite athletic performance are those performance enhancing drugs, the PEDs that you hear about on the news, or if you read the sports reports. And so these performance enhancing drugs are things like hormones and anabolic agents, things like testosterone and growth factors that will basically kind of get in your body, and their normal effect is to control growth of the body, growth of the muscle, kind of your metabolism, how you're using energy within your body. And that's occurring normally. But by taking excess levels of these things, excess levels of growth factors, excess levels of testosterone, you can kind of disrupt that normal balance and result in kind of more muscle forming. And again, a shortcut, kind of this kind of, say cheating in essence, to try to get around and get a shortcut to getting to that elite status. Stimulants in competition can make it better for your ability to concentrate and compete at that high level. Things like diuretics that flush the fluids out of your body can be used to kind of mask the agents. So all of these things are on a World Anti-Doping Code list, a list that's updated pretty regularly because the science associated with human physiology, human kind of body function is constantly evolving. And we develop these new kind of medications, we develop these new drugs and other things that we need to determine, are they providing this kind of unfair athletic advantage if we take a use of them? And so the World Anti-Doping Code is going to be enforced by the World Anti-Doping Agency, the WADA, which a lot of governments, a lot of sports leagues, and all of the Olympic sports have adopted as their kind of overseer of the rules and application of these rules associated with these performance enhancing drugs. Now, keep in mind that many of these performance enhancing drugs still have a medical use. And so for those athletes with a diagnosed medical condition, they can get a therapeutic use exemption. This means that they need to get this medication for the treatment of their individual condition, and they're not taking it in order to get an unfair advantage in competition. And so that is kind of available. But again, the goal of the World Anti-Doping Agency is to try to promote fairness in this competition. Now, there are other types of rules for promoting fairness. Examples of that are age and weight classes. If you take a look at Pop Warner football, youth league football, You don't want, little kids playing up against much larger kids, because the larger kids are going to be stronger, they're going to be faster, and they're basically going to run over the little kids and increase the risk that those littler kids are going to be injured. And so you have weight categories, you have age categories in Little League, things like that. This extends up to the professional and the Olympic level sports. Contact sports like wrestling and boxing are going to have weight classes associated with it, because how fair is it going to be to take a 112-pound flyweight, 112-pound flyweight, and put them up against a competition, a contact sport competition, against a heavyweight of 200 plus pounds, outweighing almost twice as much as them. It's going to be unfair. It's going to be difficult, and in many cases it's not going to be safe. And so there are going to be rules in competition. And so let's take a look at some of those rules and the dilemmas associated with it. Okay, so our first ethical dilemma: should there be physical or physiological limits in competition? So physical would be like size, the age and the weight that we talked about on the previous slide. Physiological limits would be like the levels of testosterone. In our example that we're looking at here, the naturally occurring levels of testosterone were a little bit higher than what we see in the normal population. Other things that we can take a look at, again, physiological, the body's processing. The VO2 max is a measurement of the ability of your body to use oxygen during exercise. So if you have a higher VO2 max, you're going to be better at doing endurance running, doing endurance sports, like maybe soccer, as opposed to kind of short sprint-like events. Eyesight, again, many of us wear glasses, the corrected vision, but many athletes are going to have very fine acuity, very fine eyesight, which is much better than the normal population, regular population. Second ethical dilemma: should the rules apply to all categories of the sport, such as an event or level of competition? So if we're going to have it, should all Olympic athletes follow the same rules, or should all Little League athletes follow the same rules for competition? In terms of events, and again, the example we're looking at today is looking at track within track and field. We see that in the track events, we've got races everywhere from 100 meters up to a 10K, 10,000 meters. We've got normal running events and hurdle events. So lots of different events that are going to be present. Should these rules, if we're taking a look at kind of levels of testosterone, apply to some of these or apply to all of these? The third ethical dilemma is, should scientific evidence be used in setting the limits for enforcement? And again, because we're looking at testosterone levels in this example, this is a 2014 paper looking at testosterone levels in elite athletes. And again, like you would expect, there is going to be a full range from very high to very low, which is going to be present. And that natural variation is normal. That natural distribution is going to be what you would expect to see. So even though that most of the athletes, and looking at male athletes on the left and female athletes on the right, most of the athletes are going to be in the same range, you're going to have some that are kind of tailing off at either end. If we take a look at the female athletes, again, serum testosterone levels, the levels of testosterone within their body, you can see that the majority of them are at that very low level. But you can see there are normal athletes that are tested post-competition. So they're not taking performance-enhancing drugs, but they have naturally occurring levels of testosterone that are higher than normal. Should we use scientific evidence to set the limits, recognizing that we've got this normal range, which is going to be present? And then our fourth and final ethical dilemma for this story is, should these Namibian runners, those runners that had this naturally occurring higher level of testosterone, be required to take medications to lower their testosterone levels to the regulated range in which they could be allowed to compete? Now, with this, I've got spoilers coming up. And so if you want to use this as a discussion, you want to think about this a little bit more, pause the video here and come back. I grew up listening to Paul Harvey on the radio. He was a newscaster, a commentator, and he would often give you the rest of the story. And so following this is going to be the rest of our story with these ethical dilemmas. And so the first question we had was, should there be physical or physiological limits in competition? You know, the slide that we've got Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, a really big guy, if you were to stand up next to him, standing between Charles Barkley and Shaquille O'Neal. And if you take a look at that, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is a big guy who looks really tiny in comparison to Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley. So should there be physiological or physical limits in competition? And what we see is that there is going to be a range of whatever measurement you make with these elite athletes, from very low to very high. But in general, elite athletes are going to be better conditioned and at the higher end of these measurements than the regular population. And some of them are going to be even at the higher level. And so if we take a look at something like VO2 max, VO2 max is the ability of your body to use oxygen during exercise. Now, for most of us, we will go and run on a daily basis or a couple times a week and build up our body's ability to use oxygen and become more fit, more aerobically fit to be able to use the oxygen. But there are going to be some athletes whose bodies and their physiology and the kind of the proteins and the chemicals within their body are going to be naturally better at using oxygen. And you see, these are going to be those elite marathon runners that are able to run incredibly fast for 2 or 2.5 hours to run 26 miles, an incredible activity. Lots of, I can't even imagine, lots of physiology, lots of things going on to be able to get them to that finish line, where it would be more challenging for us. When I ran marathons, I was doing it at 5 hours as opposed to the elite athletes doing it at 2 hours. Eyesight. Most of us, even if we've got glasses, are going to have our vision corrected towards 20/20. This ability to see things from 20 feet away as if they were 20 feet away. What normal people would be able to recognize as a line on an eye chart or an object will appear clear from 20 feet away. Most baseball players, or so on average, baseball players are going to have a visual acuity of 20/13. What that means, 20/13 means that they're able to see from 20 feet away what a regular person would be able to see from 13 feet away. So they're able to be further away and still be able to see things clearly. And that's going to help them be able to pick up the baseball as it's being pitched to them, as they're preparing to bat it, be able to get a jump on the ball as it's hit, and they're in the outfield trying to figure out where that is. So they've got that natural advantage by having a higher visual acuity, 20/13 as opposed to 20/20. But should we put limits on eyesight for baseball players? Second ethical dilemma, should the rules apply to all categories of the sport, such as an event or level of competition? The rules for testosterone that we're talking about here only apply to those races between 400 meters and a mile. And so in terms of the Olympic events, they're only going to correspond to the 400 meter, the 800 meter, the 1500 meter, and the 400 meter hurdles. But there are other events, shorter or longer, that these athletes, with their normal, naturally occurring higher levels of testosterone, they would be allowed to compete in. Now, keep in mind that most athletes train for a specific event, a specific distance of an event. And so they may be at a disadvantage to go from these middle distances to the shorter distances or the longer distances because it's not applied to all of the different events within Olympic running. The third ethical dilemma, should scientific evidence be used in setting the limits for enforcement? A variety of studies that have come out basically saying, we don't understand it completely. We don't necessarily see this connection between the higher levels of testosterone and increased performance. And so because of that, we need more information. we may not have enough information right now to know where those limits should be and whether or not even the slightly higher levels of testosterone is having an effect on athletic performance. And so we need to know more about it. And then our final ethical dilemma, these Namibian runners, should they be required to take medications to lower their naturally occurring testosterone levels to a level that is kind of accepted by the governing body of Olympic runners in order to be able to compete? Now, again, we already said that they could go to a different event, but say they want to stay with their event. In order for them to compete, they have to bring down their natural testosterone levels down to the level that's expected. So they would be taking an anti-androgen. They would be taking basically a drug that alters the hormonal balance within their body. And that has side effects associated with it. So we're asking these athletes, if you want to compete, take a drug that may cause side effects associated with things like hepatitis, liver injury, diarrhea, skin rashes, low sex drive, increased risk of depression. All of these things are at risk if we're going to go through and artificially lower their normal testosterone levels. And so that's kind of an overview of our ethical dilemma for this week. Hopefully you enjoy it. Let me know. Thank you and have a great day.